BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Tuesday, and on Tuesdays this year I've been talking to you about the story of JonBenet Ramsey, perhaps the most famous unsolved mystery in American history. And in this episode, I will be responding to the psychological profile from Pat Brown, as well as looking at the comments from the Deceptive. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the story of JonBenet Ramsey. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. In addition to the JonBenet Ramsey show, I also do segments about Jack the Ripper, D.B. Cooper, and of course, the Zodiac Killer here on BBOR. And I would like to let you know that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show, and author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. If the Zodiac case fascinates you, be sure to check out the Zodiac Revisited. It is a deep dive into the mystery with a unique and interesting perspective. The trilogy is available on Amazon, Spotify, and wherever you get your favorite true crime books. And if you enjoy the series, please consider helping Michael out by leaving a 5-star review. And I polled you guys, actually, though, about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. I left a polling question here on Black Box Online Radio. Simply, who do you think was responsible for the murder? And I was shocked by the results. The majority of the people who responded to the poll said that an intruder or a predator murdered JonBenet. And the reason why I said that I was shocked is because I can see the comments that you guys have left on this Tuesday segment, and the majority of the people in the comments believe that a family member was responsible for her murder. And you guys can share anything you want in the comment section one more time, just sharing the result. But I said that I was going to talk about Pat Brown and her psychological profile for the killer of JonBenet Ramsey. Do you ever have those moments when you should be doing something else, and then a particular video on YouTube gets your attention? Well, that happened to me with Pat Brown and her psychological profile of JonBenet. I called it a video, but it was actually a 2-hour live stream, and then I saw that she had done other live streams. She has one that's specifically on the DNA evidence, she has 2 that are on the handwriting, and even one where she responds to 60 Minutes Australia. So she took up a lot of my time, and I was very hesitant to make this episode this week for the channel because I have talked a lot about Pat Brown and her observations, specifically about some of the other cases such as the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and the Freeway Phantom, as well as D.B. Cooper here on this channel. And I, of course, want to look at different points of view, and I don't want to always come back to the same people. But at the same time, I was genuinely curious what she had to say about the murderer of JonBenet Ramsey. And she did something that I have found that to be a similar pattern of thought that exists within a lot of the people that I've talked about here on this segment for the last 3 weeks. I've talked to you guys about Denise Diana Huddle's book, which is called Anthrax to Zodiac, but it has a JonBenet section. I've talked to you about Shana Ross' book, Cold Cases, and now Pat Brown's psychological profile. And all 3 of these individuals started out by acting like they thought that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's murder back in 1996. And then they would almost make a shift about halfway through their presentations, and then they would say that, okay, it seems like the Ramseys were guilty, but at the end, they're not specifically identifying a suspect. You can tell where they're leaning, but even Pat Brown said this in her response to 60 Minutes Australia, when she said, I'm not saying the Ramseys are guilty, I'm just saying that there's no evidence of an intruder. It seems like that all 3 of these people do not want to get sued. And you'll remember that Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's brother, sued CBS for $750 million after they put out the documentary that accused him of being JonBenet's killer. And it seems like people are very, very hesitant of that. And it also seems that they are going to be very hesitant to make these direct accusations. But we should remember that CBS didn't end up paying the full $750 million. They settled out of court, and I don't know the specifics. They were never made public. But as I said, Pat Brown arranged her psychological profile at first by making it seem like an intruder was responsible. And people in the chat are saying things, and then she's kind of veering back toward an intruder. At first, she's like, you know what, just a random stranger who had no affiliation with the Ramsey household doesn't seem very plausible. It's almost as if it was a family friend or someone who had inside connections who knew specific things about the house. But she said family friend, right? And, looking at how somebody could have entered the house when the Ramseys were at the Christmas party on December 25th, JonBenet's found dead on December 26th, and then it's almost as if that they were in the house, they took the pen and the pad from the Ramsey home and wrote this 2.5-page ransom note. And then somebody asked a question about the sexual assault that was committed on JonBenet, and Pat Brown even says, it's not necessary that a perpetrator would take her body outside of the home or take JonBenet outside of the home to commit a crime like that, because the Ramsey house was so big. It was a mansion. You might only see like the chalet gable in the front in a lot of the photos, and in the ones that I use here on BBOR, but it was a very big house, and if they took her to the basement, they perhaps would think that they would be able to do anything that they wanted to JonBenet without interruption. And I'm like, okay, well, she's really making a case for an intruder, but someone who has direct connections. This would not be like somebody who stalked JonBenet from the beauty pageants, or somebody who had just been eyeing her down and waiting for the opportune moment. It seemed like someone who had direct access and involvement to the Ramsey family. Other evidence for this that is from different sources, I mean, it's even from John Ramsey himself. He's quoted as saying, on the day that JonBenet's body was found, December 26th of 96, he said that it seems like this was an inside job. This was somebody who knew a lot about the house, because JonBenet's body was found in the wine cellar of the home, which is really like an unfinished room with concrete on the floor. I think the wine cellar was more like a layout term. And she had duct tape over her mouth. Her hands and wrists were bound behind her head. Really, it's her wrist. The rope is around her wrist, going over her sweater. She had vomited at some point during the ordeal, and of course, she was found deceased. She had been sexually assaulted with a paintbrush, and the head of the paintbrush has never been recovered. She was struck in the head with a blunt object, which left an 8.5-inch crack in her skull, and she was strangled with a garrote. Now, the head of the paintbrush was most likely removed, and then the paintbrush was turned into the wooden piece that was used in the garrote to increase the amount of force that could be used when strangling JonBenet. So that's how her body is found. And then, she's found in this room called the wine cellar, and then John Ramsey openly stated that it seems like somebody had familiarity with the house, because he didn't talk about the wine cellar. Nobody outside of the family should have known about the wine cellar. Now, is that a confession hiding in plain sight? We'll come back to that later on. But then Pat Brown is just saying that this house was so big that somebody could have committed the crime, and they wouldn't really worry about being interrupted. And it's almost as if she's like making the case that the intruder theory seems plausible. Then she would have a very big reversal. And one thing, though, that she seems to note that a lot of people would disagree with is, if you look at the personalities of the Ramsey family members, I'm going to paraphrase, but this is what she stated. John Ramsey is extremely cold and maybe even emotionless. Patsy Ramsey is not emotionless, but she's very bizarre, and Burke Ramsey is very childish. Okay, Burke was 9 years old at the time. I mean, childish goes without saying. But she really began to zone in on John Ramsey, because she states that he wants people to think that he's very warm-hearted and emotional, and she says almost that she can see through his act where he is actually a very cold and emotionless person. That's, again, I'm laying out her case. So when she begins to look at the actions of the Ramseys, they come down the stairs. This is Patsy Ramsey on the day after Christmas going down the stairs, and she finds 3 pieces of paper that are laid out. It's a 2.5-page ransom note, and it says, Mr. Ramsey, listen, we have your daughter. We want $118,000 or she will be beheaded, and she will not see 1997. We'll call you between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. And that's the ransom note. I have a whole episode about it here on BBOR if you'd like to hear specific analyses of it. So then Patsy Ramsey checks to see if JonBenet is there, and then she makes phone calls. She calls 911 and her friends. And I also have an episode about the 911 transcript. Now, as a psychological profiler and criminal profiler, Pat Brown looks at some very specific points. And the first is that Patsy Ramsey says, "I just found the ransom note," not "I found the ransom note." And she uses the word "just" multiple times during the 911 call. And again, in Pat Brown's own criminal profiling way, she says that when people use the word "just," that has a higher frequency of not telling the truth than not. There's a higher chance that someone is lying when they're using the word "just." It is more normal for people to say, "I found the ransom note," not "I just found the ransom note." And I have a lot of mixed feelings about that, but I'll save my comments until the end. Then she says that Patsy Ramsey is going against the instructions of the ransom note, but I think that that is also totally normal, and Pat Brown even gave that to her as well. Like, if you find the ransom note, even though it says don't call 911, people would still call 911 because that is the response. That's just one of the only things you can do after they learned that JonBenet was missing. But I told you that she would have this reversal and start to blame the Ramseys. What she said was, "It is purely implausible for an intruder to leave a 3-page ransom note at the bottom of the stairs. Firstly, if the intruder were trying to commit some type of sexual act on JonBenet in the basement, or take JonBenet out of the house, or do anything to JonBenet, it would have taken around 21 minutes to write the ransom note." And she believes that people who are psychopathic sadists are very impatient. These are the types of people that would just be scrolling the internet looking for any opportunity to attack somebody. They are going to want to act as quickly as possible. Methodically, yes, but as quickly as possible. And they wouldn't have the patience to write a 21-page ransom note. Point number 2. She states that it's implausible that the 3-page ransom note would be left at the foot of the stairs because they wouldn't know when the Ramseys were going to come down. What if somebody woke up in the middle of the night and wanted a glass of water? What if somebody woke up in the middle of the night and they wanted to get something from downstairs? What if somebody woke up in the middle of the night for any reason? They could have set those 3 pages of paper on the stairs, and then somebody comes down 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 4 minutes later, and then they're just completely interrupted if the killer is still in the basement area with JonBenet. So that's another one. Then she begins to look at the actions and activities of the Ramseys when JonBenet's body is found. Firstly, she states that John Ramsey left the house for about 1 hour during the morning before JonBenet was discovered. And he was looking for the mail, actually. Apparently that's in the timeline. And she said that's extremely bizarre. I admit, yes it is. She also notices that the Ramseys are expecting a phone call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., yet they don't seem extremely surprised when the call doesn't come at 10 a.m. Does that not suggest that they already knew that she was dead? Then Linda Arndt, the detective who was first on site, instructed the family to search the home. Okay, and John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White didn't actually search the way that she requested. And even Pat Brown says this is a ridiculous thing to do. They should have sealed the perimeter, and the authorities should have been the ones to do that to avoid contamination and evidence collection and all that. But John Ramsey finds JonBenet's body. And this is where the profilers are going to go head to head. Because the FBI profiler John Douglas says that John Ramsey's actions after finding JonBenet's body indicate that he was not guilty, that he did not have anything to do with her murder. Because when he found JonBenet, she was on the floor, she had her hands tied over her head, rigor mortis had kicked in, and she was so stiff she couldn't be moved, and she had duct tape over her mouth, and then John Ramsey pulls the duct tape off and throws it to the ground. And John Douglas uses this as one of the core elements of his psychological profile, because he's all about, if John Ramsey had staged the scene and put the duct tape over her mouth, it would have been impractical and illogical for him to remove it before the members of law enforcement had seen the staging. Why stage something and then unstage it before somebody could see it? Pat Brown will challenge this very simply by saying, at firstly, she completely admits that if somebody were to find their child, a family member, somebody that they were looking for in the wine cellar with the duct tape over their mouth, the first thing that they would do is to remove it. Because if there was any chance at all to see a sign of life, they would remove the duct tape to see if the person could still breathe. She's like, okay, absolutely. That's what an innocent person would do. It's the second thing that she will use to show that the Ramseys may have been guilty of either murder or cover-up or both. And she says that John Ramsey removed the duct tape, threw it to the ground, and then he went for the restraints on JonBenet's wrists. She was tied, and her hands were tied above her head, as I said. And she's like, this is not consistent with someone who is going to be looking for signs of life in a dead child, or, okay, even if he's not 100% sure that she's dead, that's not consistent. What he should have done was try to open her airway, look to see if she was breathing, check for other signs of life, perform CPR, because even if there's the smallest chance that she might still be alive, freeing her hands would not help anything. If he's actually trying to save her life, or as a father who's actually concerned for the life of his daughter, freeing her hands wouldn't help anything. I mean, pulling the duct tape off, that would allow somebody to breathe more easily, sure, but going for the rope on the hands, or the cord on the hands rather, that would not help the problem. That would not solve the problem. Alright, so that's one point. And then, I mean, JonBenet is brought upstairs, and then the detective, Linda Arndt, also allows him to cover JonBenet's body with a white blanket, which could have contaminated the scene even further. So this is another point, though, that Pat Brown is going to look at in terms of vilifying the Ramseys. She also states that it seems as if they made some very bizarre statements when they're saying that after JonBenet has been found dead, they still want to leave the state, and they want to go to Atlanta, and they want to go on a plane to Atlanta, and then the authorities are just like, absolutely not, your daughter was just murdered. And Pat Brown is like, it doesn't matter if you had a previously established travel plan. If somebody found their child murdered, wouldn't they want to stay with the authorities and be as close to the investigation as possible? It's almost as if they laid out the ransom note in a way in which it was very impractical and not helpful at all for an intruder. They also seem to have not shown any real concern or regard for the 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. phone call. Perhaps they already knew that JonBenet was dead, and then they want to leave the state because they know what happened already. Like, even though the police are still investigating the crime, did they not already know the entire story? And then all of these things are suggesting that the Ramseys are either guilty, involved, covering up, all of the above. And then she will also zone in on some very particular statements, such as one that was made by John Ramsey when he said, I hope this will be resolved and the authorities will learn everything and all the information that is possible. All the information possible, something to that effect. And she's like, wait a second, you want it to be resolved? Learn everything that is possible? Does that not suggest that it's only possible for him to know the truth? She's like, this is inconsistent language with someone who is telling the truth. Now, it could be something to the effect of, he wants, I mean, like, an innocent person would be more likely to say, he wants to know everything, period. They wouldn't say everything possible, everything, period. And as far as resolved, he wants this case solved. Like, an innocent person would say something that's more like, we want this case solved, and we want the authorities to know everything. And I completely see her point there. But at this time, I would like to offer some challenges. Which interpretation of the evidence do you think makes more sense? Because everything that I have said is really looking at John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey. And what do you think about all of these statements about how they have the ransom note in the odd place, about how JonBenet is found in the Ramsey's home, and John Ramsey says it looks like an inside job? What do you think about John Ramsey not really showing any concern for the 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. time frame when the kidnappers are supposed to call? Just share everything you want in the comment section down below. But as far as the challenges. Number one, I have never, well, I wouldn't say never. I've always looked at the theory of someone having close knowledge of the Ramseys more closely than just a random perpetrator. And there's a book out there called Little Girl Blue: The Inside Circle Theory by Sweetie B that really does explore this concept as well, because it seems as if if you're going to look at an intruder, you can differentiate it in two ways. You have someone who had no connection to the Ramsey family, or an intruder that was not John, Patsy, or Burke, but did have a strong connection to the family. And I totally saw what Pat Brown was saying about the strong connection, because this would be somebody who would have known about the Ramseys' movements. They knew that they were at the Christmas party. They knew that they were going to be coming home late. They knew about where things were in the house. Maybe they even knew where JonBenet's bedroom was. But no matter whom this is, let's even say, more importantly, the ransom note says that they won $118,000, and that was John Ramsey's annual bonus from the previous year, actually. So this person clearly knew something about the Ramseys. Let's just look at this from a different perspective. If the killer entered the home when they were at the Christmas party, and this could have been done through an unlocked door, this could have been done through a window. The broken window in the basement is one possibility, although you guys always remind me that there really isn't a lot of disturbed ground around the broken window. Maybe this person even had stolen a key or something like that. That's just, one possibility. But this whole statement of how a psychopathic sadist is not patient, I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Psychopathic sadists can be extremely patient. As a case in point, the Golden State Killer. Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, once waited in the bushes for 4 hours for a family to come home so he could attack them. 4 hours with no cell phone, no internet or anything like that. He is just sitting there in the bushes and waiting, and that's not an isolated incident. I mean, psychopaths can have an extraordinarily high amount of patience. What Pat Brown was talking about is, if somebody were online, they would open 10 different windows on their computer, 10 different messages going out on different apps. Hey, how are you? Hey, how are you? Oh, hey, you want to meet up? You want to meet up? You want to meet up? And this predator is messaging someone, and they might be older than JonBenet, of course, to have access to these things, but they're just looking for people with 10 different windows, using messaging apps, looking at photos, and they just go after the person who is the most vulnerable. And she's using that as an example to demonstrate that psychopathic sadists are not patient. Well, sometimes they are. I mean, serial killers can spend an enormous amount of time plotting and planning. And we're going to talk about this more on a future episode of Black Box Online Radio, because I've been going through the comments that have been made by Dr. Gary Brucato, who talks about certain, like, the way that in which someone commits a crime can reveal more about how much patience they have. And sometimes these sadistic murders can reveal that the killer had an enormous amount of patience. So I really, really just disagree with that point as a blanket statement. And as far as the actions and activities of Patsy Ramsey when she's making the phone call and says that she just found the ransom note as opposed to I found the ransom note, I don't necessarily think that that is the most vilifying thing. I used to watch a lot of those channels. I'm sure you have too. And I would actually like to continue this discussion because there's a channel out there called The Deceptive that specializes in analyzing statements. In fact, it's hosted by an attorney who, by his own admission, is someone who specializes in statement analysis, and it tries to determine whether or not people are telling the truth. This guy has made a lot of videos about the Madeleine McCann case, but he has numerous episodes on the JonBenet Ramsey case as well. And, I mean, he played one, and I'm not gonna lie, Even though you guys, followers of Black Box Online Radio, know that I heavily support and lean toward the theory that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's murder, this one pushed my limits. It almost brought me to the breaking point, and it had absolutely nothing to do with his commentary. It was the interview that John and Patsy Ramsey did with Barbara Walters. It was just their own words. Specifically, it's the actions of Patsy Ramsey, where she just is so awkward with her tone of voice. Her eyes get wide. She just raises her voice with every question and just acts like she's just completely confused, even though that interview was done 3 years after the murder of JonBenet. And it's just very unnatural. And this is one of the biggest reasons why people suspect the Ramseys, because all of their actions seem so unnatural. And that's ultimately why Pat Brown would lean toward them being the murderers of JonBenet. But I would like to look at some specific statements that were made by the Deception Detective in his videos. We've already talked about the word just. That when Patsy Ramsey made the 911 call, she used the word just multiple times. I just found the note, as opposed to I found the note. And the Deception Detective says that this also has a higher chance of being untruthful as opposed to being truthful. Pat Brown said it in her show, he said it on his show. This is a red flag. And the Deception Detective also has a condition for his episodes. Just because somebody is using these words from the English language does not mean that this person is lying. These are red flags. And when he says red flag, it means it's something that you need to pay attention to that could suggest that a person was lying. And I'm going to be very honest with you. I completely appreciate the professional stance. This guy's an attorney who specializes in this. He is a professional, and I am not. I'm just some guy in the audience like anybody else. But I have problems with these types of analyses. First and foremost, so I will also give credit to the fact that I think that word choice and tone of voice and just your vocal patterns have a higher chance of predicting the truth than things like body language and particularly the way someone's eyes look. For example, with the eyes, they say that you have to be looking in the eye for somebody to tell the truth. And you can even see this on like talk shows or the court shows when they say, no, you're not allowed to wear sunglasses on this program. We need to be looking you in the eye. The eyes are the window to the soul. Have you not heard that one before? The eyes are the window to the soul. But in reality, the eyes are not the window to the soul. If anything, people who are not telling the truth are aware of this commonly held belief, so they try to overcompensate by just looking someone directly in the eye, making prolonged eye contact, or if anything, will make a normal amount of eye contact, because that's what they expect people to look at, as opposed to things like tone of voice. I am not the biggest fan of body language analyses, as opposed to something such as voice stress analysis. There's a reason why law enforcement uses voice stress analysis as opposed to looking at someone in the eye and just going with their gut feeling, and also with looking at their body language. Your voice can actually be a bigger indication of telling the truth or not. Now, with that being said, let's look at some problems with these types of analyses. When someone is saying the word just, like I just found the note versus I found the note, does one of them have a higher chance of telling the truth or not? Well, when Patsy Ramsey appeared in her interview with Barbara Walters, every 10th word out of her mouth was the word just. And this guy, the Deception Detective, is just stopping the recording all the time, like, there, she said it again. I just found the note, and then I just called 911, and then I just talked to John. She's saying that word so frequently that I really began to think about it. When do we use the word just in the English language? For me, I began to think of all the examples. It's like if you get to some place quickly, you say, I just got here. Maybe you sit down for your lunch break at work and your boss says, you get back to work. You would say, I just sat down. We use this phrase or this word in the English language to indicate moments of expediency, quickness, and also deflection, meaning trying to show that you didn't do something. So that would also be consistent with not telling the truth. Again, something as simple as that, I'm not the biggest fan of because it's not an exact science. Have you not said that statement? I just got here. I just sat down. You're trying to show that there is a certain quickness to your actions, and also you're trying to show that you didn't do anything wrong. You get to work. I just got here. You get back to work. I just sat down for my lunch break. But I will give credit to the deception detective for one thing. Somebody recently asked me, hey, when did you last go to the post office? I'm paraphrasing for the episode, but it was about the post office. And I said, I just went this week. But it wasn't actually this week. It was about 2 weeks ago to check on something. Okay, and I was like, aha, deception detective, you were on there. I did do that. When, I mean, it's not a pure lie. It's what we would call a half-truth, or it might be something that is a little bit harmless, but I am going to be much more aware of that when someone is trying to misrepresent the situation. So I'm only sharing this stuff to show that I did use that in the truthful context and also in a deceptive context. So this provides a little bit of clarity to the situation. Another example of odd word choices that are used by the Ramseys, or possibly in the JonBenet Ramsey case, would be found in the ransom note. One of them, and this one I really don't like, that was brought up by the deception detective, is that it says that they need to listen carefully. It says, Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. And that's how the ransom note begins. Listen carefully. And he's just like, why would somebody say listen if it's written in a note? Does this not suggest that there could be a father, a husband, who is dictating words to his wife, the mother, telling her what to write down? Now, maybe he could be spot on with that, or that could be what somebody chose to write, because I've definitely started an email with the word listen, or a message with the word listen, and I began to think about the context in which I have done that in the past. It was meant to show seriousness, strong emotion, and also that you really want someone to pay attention. Have you ever started an email or a message, or maybe a handwritten letter with the word listen? I would love to know your response. Please put it in the comment section down below. And even before listen, there is Mr. Ramsey. He's pointing out that this note was only written to John Ramsey. It says Mr. Ramsey. And why doesn't it say Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey? Were they expecting that John Ramsey was going to find it first? There's no way they could have known that. There were 3 people in the house. But is this not from an egocentric businessman who thought so highly of himself that there's no way a kidnapper would write a note to his wife? No reason to write Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey? First of all, it's John Ramsey's money. That's the way that he would process it. Is that what happened? Or what's the alternative? That this is somebody who had a grudge against John Ramsey, who had a specific reason for going after the Ramsey household. Yes, I'm not even going to play any type of devil's advocate. I think the person who murdered JonBenet had an obsession with her, an unhealthy obsession with her. Everybody thinks that. Whether you think it was John, Patsy, Burke, or an intruder, everyone says that there is some type of unhealthy obsession. This wasn't just somebody who saw her the day before once and was like, oh, I'm going to find out where that girl lives. I'm going to track her down. Absolutely not. I think this person had followed JonBenet for a very long time, knew a lot about her, and also knew a lot about the Ramsey family. Just my take on the subject. Please put your ideas in the comment section down below about what you think. And I just have one more small thing to say, and that is that a lot of these things seem like they could have very simple explanations. You're pointing out red flags. Oh, the word listen, Mr. Ramsey. I just found this note. These are also very common things that are used in the English language. One of them, though, that is absolutely unacceptable to me is when the deception detective says that the kidnapper wrote in the note, I represent a small foreign faction. Small foreign faction was used in the ransom note, and what this person said is that you cannot be foreign to yourself, meaning that no one would say that. Like, if you were to ask the deception detective, what's your nationality? He would say American. In no context would you say that you are a foreigner or that you represent a small foreign faction. Now, this person, I don't even know his name. He's called the deception detective. He maybe has not lived in another country. As you guys know, I have been in the Philippines for quite some time, and when you're in another country, you refer to yourself as a foreigner. I've also lived in other parts of Asia, and we had foreigner communities, and you call yourself a foreigner when you are not in your own country. That's just what happens, and foreigners from all different walks of life do this when they are not in their own country, and that one is just absolutely unacceptable to me. But I do want to point out some things. The reason why I'm a little bit hyped up about this is because I've been accused of lying at certain times in my life when I was telling the truth. I have been accused of lying because of all these reasons, word choice, as well as other things like the way that you say it. And here's another thing that we should put on that list with the things about body language and movements, smiling and laughing. And I don't see this too much from Patsy and John. We see it more from Burke Ramsey. And this wasn't the focus of the Deception Detective. He looks more at word choice and how the words are constructed. Not to mention a little bit with tonality and actions and behaviors. But smiling and laughing. For example, I had a very, benign instance in my family once when somebody asked me, were you up at midnight watching ESPN? They asked me that because they turned the TV on and ESPN was the first thing that came on. This was back when we had DirecTV. And I was like, no, I just checked the score of the game before I went to bed. And it was true. I wasn't up at midnight watching TV. And somebody said, I heard something moving around in the living room at night. Was that you? I started smiling and laughing, like, what? No. And then they accused me of lying. They say they caught you in a lie. But that's not what happened. I was telling the truth, but because I laughed, they thought I was not telling the truth. So these things are very, very up in the air. And you cannot just point to this and be like, someone is not telling the truth because of this reason. One specific example that is discussed by the Deception Detective is the use of sentence fragments. And John Ramsey did this a lot when he was narrating about how he found JonBenet's body. And the Deception Detective says, when people are telling the truth, they're more likely than not to use full sentences. When they are not telling the truth, it's more common to use sentence fragments, like John Ramsey would say something purely for an example. These aren't the exact words, I'm paraphrasing, but this is the exact structure. When he found JonBenet's body, he said, I went down the stairs, around the corner, to the wine cellar. She was on the floor, on the ground. He's using some sentences, but lots of sentence fragments. He's not talking in full sentences all of the time. And if somebody is telling the truth, they would say, I went down the stairs, and then I went around the corner, and then I went into the wine cellar. So I completely understand what the Deception Detective is saying. He means that someone is thinking about what they have to say as opposed to what they actually said. And I don't like this at all either, because I've definitely been accused of lying for that exact same reason, again, when I was telling the truth, saying something just as simple. What did you do when you first got home? Well, I got out of the car, closed the car door, walked to the house, turned the key in the lock, went inside. Someone accused me of lying again for something very simple, even though I was telling the truth, for using sentence fragments. So I'm not impressed by this type of analysis either. I would love to know what you guys think about these types of deception tactics. I totally know where it's coming from. It means that if you are telling the truth, you don't have to remember any fake story. If you are telling the truth, your brain has to work a lot less harder because you don't have to fabricate things. And I will give a solid point to the Deception Detective. When somebody is creating a lie, they're not going to cover all the bases. They aren't going to be aware of how their lie is going to affect things, where then they didn't account for, well, what were you doing when the event happened? How could that be possible if this happened? Oh, I didn't think about that. Then you have to tell another lie to cover up the first lie, and so on and so on. And it can look like somebody is thinking these things with their imagination, as opposed to saying them straight in the form of a narrative. But this begs the question of, if John Ramsey is not telling the truth, why is he going on all of these shows? And Pat Brown discussed this in her live stream. She has multiple live streams. This was specifically the one on Gary Oliva as a JonBenet Ramsey suspect. And she pointed out that John Ramsey has done numerous TV interviews. He's appeared at CrimeCon. He has been, like interviewed for books. He's written his own books about this, The Death of Innocence and The Other Side of Suffering. If he were actually involved with his daughter's death, wouldn't he do something different? Wouldn't he want to stay in the shadows? Pat Brown proposed something, and that was that John Ramsey believes that he is exonerated, that he has been exonerated. The DNA did not match him. The touch DNA and the DNA under JonBenet's fingernails did not match John Ramsey. Even if it did, then this would still just beg the question of how would that be relevant to the father, because he's her father. He could always say, yes, I touched her long johns. I'm even the one who put them on. He could say something to that effect. Oh, I just forgot. Yes, I think you get where I'm coming from. He could always make up a backstory about why his DNA was on his daughter's clothing. Touch DNA, mind you. And Pat Brown's like, that's what it is. It's touch DNA. It's not semen, and it's also not blood. If it were one of those two things, they would have a much stronger case. But John Ramsey knows that none of the forensic evidence that the police have could be connected back to him. Therefore, he doesn't mind going public about this. But that doesn't answer the full question. Why would somebody do that if they were guilty? If they were either responsible for the murder of their daughter or involved in the cover-up of the murder of their daughter, wouldn't they want to stay silent? Wouldn't they just want to be in the shadows? And there's a very simple response to that. It's something that I've dealt with a lot here on Black Box Online Radio, because we see people who are serving life in prison, or maybe sometimes they've even been on death row for 20 years, and they're obviously guilty, but they don't confess. And the answer is, they get locked into a story. They have decided that they are not only going to stick to the story, they're going to live it out. They're going to act it out. This is the version of the story that they're going to share to the general public. In a certain way, they know the truth. Again, countless convicted murderers. People who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole, and people are like, why don't you just confess? Clearly you did this. They've decided that they're not going to. They want to live this out. And in some instances with the prisoners, they think that maybe they will get some type of reward for good behavior. If they confess to the murder, it's game over. If they pretend that they are innocent, maybe their attorney could argue that they didn't get a fair trial, that their rights were violated. It's just to their benefit. And with somebody like John Ramsey, he was never convicted of this. Absolutely, it would be in his benefit and best interest to stay out of prison, but that also points out that Patsy Ramsey passed away from ovarian cancer, and her cancer that was in remission in 1996 returned. She died from cancer in 2006. She didn't leave any type of deathbed confession behind, and that is another reason why people begin to shift their focus from John Ramsey to Burke Ramsey, and that the parents covered up for him. And, the deception detective openly states that his suspect is Burke Ramsey. He's very careful with his words because he doesn't want to get sued. But he states that he believes that Burke Ramsey was responsible for the murder of his sister because a woman like Patsy Ramsey would not cover up for her husband. If he murdered JonBenet, why would she go along with that? But if it were the son, and they didn't know that he wouldn't be charged with murder, Burke was 9 years old. He was too young to be charged with murder. But if he, Burke, murdered JonBenet, and they staged this whole elaborate cover-up, he would be the type of person that Patsy Ramsey would protect, and also the type of person that she wouldn't out in a deathbed confession. So this is another thing, though, that was heavily discussed by the deception detective when he pointed out that the Ramseys don't seem to mind talking about how JonBenet died. They'll often refer to the death of their daughter as opposed to the murder or the murderer. Does that mean that they knew it was Burke the whole time and they covered up for him? And they realized early on that they made a terrible mistake, that Burke was 9 years old, and according to the law, he wouldn't even be able to be charged with murder. But I actually have to give a shout out to DNA King. I saw this comment on an older JonBenet episode, one of the older Black Box recordings, when he just said, the Ramseys wouldn't have known the law, specifically Patsy Ramsey. They probably got their understanding of the law from movies, maybe even the movie Ransom that says don't try to grow a brain, so they thought of something that was an elaborate cover-up. And the deception detective has a different take on the subject when he says that it's not exactly that it would have been something to do with thinking like a movie. Instead, it was that John Ramsey was a high-profile businessman, and if it turned out that his son was a murderer, or that he was the murderer, everything comes crashing down. Well, guess what? Everything did come crashing down no matter what. I would like to know, what do you think about anything that has been discussed in this episode? I know a lot has been covered. John Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, and Patsy Ramsey, as well as the comments from Pat Brown, as well as from the Deception Detective. What do you think about the psychological profile created by Pat Brown? What do you think about the deception analysis from the Deception Detective? And of course, who do you think was responsible for the murder of JonBenet Ramsey? Now, I've shared everything I had to say about Pat Brown's profile. I've also tried to be very clear that even though I don't think very highly of deception analyses by word choice, I do think that it is more useful than just body language and body language experts. But please give your feedback in the comment section down below. I would love to read anything that you have to say. That's all for me. Now, you guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan. And this show also has the images that you are seeing going by on the screen. They get archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook. That's the name of the page, True Crime Designs. And on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, I release shorts Monday through Friday that mostly talk about serial killers, true crime news, but anything under the sun or in the darkness is fair game. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And I'll see you tomorrow for a new episode about Jack the Ripper. Until next time.